I thought that it would be interesting as a bit of a sort of side note from all of these super, I guess, really intricate talks on the brain, that we now have this amazing science to really comprehend how the brain functions, to understand where our understanding of the brain has actually come from. And I've put a little bit of an amendment to my title here. It is now a brief and dark history of the brain and nervous system. And the reason is that there were a lot of very sort of controversial and interesting experiments that were done. So if you're a little bit weak in the stomach, I'd probably say it's probably a good time to go and make a cup of tea, because we'll be talking about some of those. So the brain, as John and Brian has sort of emphasized, is one of the most complicated things in the universe for its size. But it hasn't always been appreciated as such. As Rakshanya mentioned before, the ancient Egyptians actually thought that the brain was a very underwhelming and a very under-impressing organ. So they weren't super impressed by it. In fact, they were so little impressed by it that they used to scoop the brains out through the nasal cavity of mummies before they would mummify them. And they thought that the heart and the liver were much more relevant to the human body and how it functioned. But with that being said, there was evidence up to 30,000 years ago already that people were starting to figure out that the brain and what was inside the skull was actually important to our brain's processes, or our body's processes in perceiving the world and also living. And there was this paper that was published 2 years ago in Anthropological Journal in 2019, which showed that this was suspected to be the first death by bludgeoning to the head. So this person was actually attacked by another person, and they were smacked in the head and they were killed. So it's been known for a very, very long time that this area of your body is very, very important. But it wasn't until sort of the great philosophers started to come to light and start writing works on thought and feeling that we started to develop solid theories of the mind. So I've called this section Ancient Greek Philosophers with Beards. And the first one that I would like to talk about is Homer. So Homer, in many of his works, the most famous of which is the Odyssey, seems to actually speak from one's organs. So there's one particular example that I have here where he is responding to some people who are trying to court his wife, or they're hitting on his wife, essentially. And it is, "Be still, my heart, thou hast known worse than this." So he actually thought that these feelings and these, I guess, experiences were actually separate from your brain. So your heart was really driving something that was really upsetting. And it wasn't really posited that there were other factors until Hippocrates came up with a concept called humorism. So in his theory of humorism, he talked about 4 humors that made up the body. So humors were these liquids that were thought to be produced in the body, and when you were born, these things would make up everything that you were. And the first that he described was blood, which was supposed to be responsible for a sanguine nature, also known as optimism, or people who are I guess, very calm in very bad circumstances are known to be sanguine in nature. Yellow bile, which is associated with a choleric nature. This is people who are very bad-tempered or irritable, so very aggressive sort of people. Black bile, which is known, he thought, underlay a melancholic nature. So this is also sort of in parallel to depression or down moods. And a phlegmatic nature. So this was thought to be underlied by phlegm, and this was sort of someone who was socially reserved was known to be phlegmatic in nature. And it was these humors that for a long time actually informed medical practices. So if people were a little bit too optimistic or remarkably calm, they might try and remove some of the blood by bloodletting, or they might try and cool down the body if someone was hot-blooded, say. Also in Greek philosophy, there was this idea of different areas of the soul being stored in different parts of the body. So Plato has a very interesting theory of the soul, which is the tripartite theory of the soul, and he talked about it in his book, The Republic. So the first part of the soul he thought was stored in the head, which was called the logistikon, or the logical. So this was your rational thought, this was your logic, this was everything that you would use to comprehend the world around you. The second part of the soul he described as thiomedes, and this was known as the spirited. So this was things that were you were really passionate about and you were driven to do, was thought to come from this area of the soul in the heart. And then the final one is the epithymikon, which was thought to come from the stomach, which was the appetite or the desires of a person. So these are the intrinsically very selfish desires of someone. And it was thought that the logic, so the areas in the mind or the head, were immortal, and those in the heart or the stomach, so the spirit and the appetite or desires, were perishable. So thought could not be destroyed, but spirit and desire could. So someone who was really pioneering in, I guess, suggesting that different organs were responsible for different things was Aristotle. So Aristotle, I've called it poking people's organs for philosophy, because he really first noted the importance of the heart and the brain to the body. But he actually decided that the heart was responsible for sensation, not the brain. And the thinking behind this was sort of a good logical thought. And it was that if you touched the brain, someone could not feel it. But if you touched the heart, someone very much felt it. So he deduced from this that, therefore, sensation must come from the heart. We know this to be different now, but I guess in maybe Facebook's science world, this may have held up the test of some of the science that's coming out at the moment there. So I guess the next person who really pioneered this area was a physician called Galen. And it was really interesting that he actually managed to have so much comprehensive understanding of the body, because dissecting human bodies was really forbidden around this time in Greece. So this was in the early Common Era. So he learned about the nervous system through animals and the bodies of wounded gladiators. So if there was a big wound on a gladiator, he could see what was happening underneath the surface, and he could deduct what it was doing by anything that hadn't sort of worked throughout this time. And he was actually the first physician known to describe the function of nerves, and that they can be directly attributed to different things. And very grotesquely, he had this demonstration which he used to exemplify the role of nerves. And he would take a squealing pig into an open arena, and he would sever the nerve that would innervate the voice box, and the pig would stop squealing, obviously because there wasn't any nerve activity going into that area. And he actually thought of this as spirits that were actually flowing through the nerves. He thought they were hollow, and they contained spirits that would move to different areas of the body. So by severing this, the spirits couldn't get to the body. And this was what is known as balloonist theory. And this was a very popular theory for a very long time. So, as many pieces of history will tell you, there was a lot of silence throughout the Dark Ages. There wasn't too much progress in terms of our understanding of the nervous system and the brain. And it wasn't until the Renaissance where there was this really big drive back into the nervous system and a discovery of the brain. And Michelangelo was mentioned by Brian, and he had really gained an appreciation for the brain. But some of the most early drawings of the nervous system that are known were done by Leonardo da Vinci. So I've got a drawing here of his demonstration of the ventricles, which are these hollow, liquid-filled areas of the brain, which contain cerebrospinal fluid. But this was then really elaborated on by a very famous anatomist by the name of Andreas Vesalius. And you can see his drawings were absolutely stunning. These would actually probably stand up very well in an anatomy textbook in these days. But unfortunately, this was still led by that balloonist theory. So Andreas Vesalius and Leonardo da Vinci, even though noting that the ventricles were there, still thought that there were spirits inside of them that were driving the activity of the brain and these cells. And that stayed until a man by the name of Francis Glisson came along. And he sort of burst the balloon of balloonist theory, so to speak. So the way that he did this was to observe changes in volume in water. So the idea of the balloonists would be that if there was an influx of spirits or liquid to a muscle and it would expand, then if that muscle was put underwater and flexed or expanded, that it would then spill over. So I've demonstrated this here. So you've got a balloon in this vat of water. If you blow it up, then you're going to have this spillover of water because there's going to be more volume in there. So what he did is he repeated this with someone with their bicep in there, and he found that there was absolutely no change to the level of the water. So there was no overspill of the water. In fact, there was actually a slight reduction in the water level. So he used this theory to pretty much say balloonist theory is complete rubbish. We need to start thinking of other theories. And someone who came along with another one of those theories was Albrecht von Hallen, and he posited the idea of irritation. So he said that nerves were sensible because they could perceive people's contact, and they had this sort of, I guess, conscious drive behind them, so people could use their nerves to drive their actions, whereas muscles were irritable because they could actually be activated without conscious thought. So this could either be by manual stimulation or touch, or through electricity. So he conducted a very famous series of experiments to distinguish these nerve impulses, and muscular contractions could be done through physical touch and through electricity. This was then picked up by a scientist by the name of Luigi Galvani. And Galvani was very, very famous for his experiments working with frogs' legs. So he would dissect a frog in sort of just after it had died. He would then put an electrode into nerves in the hip, and he would touch another side of the electrode to the calves of the frog. And the frog's legs would twitch almost as if it was jumping. And he actually found that he could do this without any sort of electrical wiring coming to this particular preparation. So he found that even if it was just the electrodes touching these two areas, that he could invoke this movement. It was later found out by a researcher by the name of Walzer that the metals that he'd used to make these electrodes, he'd actually just accidentally created the first battery. And even though we now know that there are some electrical properties of nerves, this wasn't quite the conclusion that he had hoped for. But rather horrifically, this was very, very popular because it was such an interesting thing. You could bring things back to life by pumping them full of electricity. And this became quite problematic in 1751 in England when the Murder Act was passed. So the Murder Act stated that if someone had murdered someone, you were then able to use their body for science as soon as they were punished or executed for so. And this led to something called reanimation, which is where people in the streets would hook up dead murderers to giant sources of electricity, and they would essentially shock them, and it would cause all of their muscles to contract and convulse. And people were obviously completely horrified by this. Like, these people were bringing people back from the dead after they'd just been executed for murder. So this was actually one of the inspirations for Mary Shelley to write Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, which I think is quite interesting. So after the electrical nature of the nervous system was discovered, people started to get ideas of the brain being an organ of the mind. But a lot of people thought that there were other parts of the head that could actually tell a lot about a person and the nature of thought. So phrenology was developed by Franz Gall and Johann Spurzheim. And they believed that if you looked at particular parts of the skull, you could tell a lot about the brain itself. So even though they believed the brain was an organ of the mind, they believed that the nature of the mind could be told by the skull. So what they would do is they would use the shape of the skull and particular areas of the skull to predict people's personality, sort of like using, I guess, horoscopes to predict people's personalities. So what they would do is they'd take these sorts of apparatus that would measure different areas of the skull to people's houses, and they would say, your son is going to be a genius, your daughter is going to marry wealthy, and people would pay phenomenal amounts of money for this. And there were some scientists that were completely revolted by this idea, but this was very, very popular amongst higher society at the time. So around this time, this is a story that most people who have looked into neuroscience or the history of neuroscience would have heard of. There was a man named Phineas Gage who came to be known as this very infamous medical marvel. And the reason that he became known as a medical marvel is he was a foreman working on a railway. And essentially, he was impaled directly through the skull and the brain with a railroad spike. And despite having such a traumatic injury and such a large injury to the brain, he started to function almost completely normally. So it was all, even to the extent that he used to take his railroad spike around to different cities and use himself sort of like a theme park attraction. So people could take photos with the man who survived the railroad spike through the brain. But most interestingly was that his family throughout this period noted that he had changes to his personality. Now, this is sort of debated by historians, saying that this is purely circumstantial. The family could have said anything. It could have been a trauma response. But it was around this time that scientists did actually start discovering the functions of different areas of the brain through a theory known as localization. So the first person to really nail down this theory was Marie-Jeanne Pierre Florin, sorry. I'm terrible at pronouncing French names. And he was really, really against phrenology and the skulls. And he thought that the skull would tell us nothing about the intrinsic workings of the mind, but instead the brain really was really driving what we were feeling and our experiences. And he developed a theory called field theory, which was that different parts of the brain were responsible for different things. Particularly, he suggested that the cerebral hemispheres, so these very large wrinkly bits in this picture here, were underlying perception, motor responses and judgment. The cerebellum, which is this sort of very stripy structure at the bottom of this slide here, were involved in equilibrium and motor coordination. And then the brainstem down the bottom here was involved in vital functions of the body. So things like heart rate and breathing. So he found that if you destroyed these areas in animals, you would have deficits in these corresponding brain regions. Just an interesting side note as well, he was one of the first people to discover anesthesia through the use of chloroform too. Now, two scientists picked up on this notion by Florenz called Gustav Fritz and Edward Hitzig. And they really elegantly showed that this was actually a true notion. So what they did is they directly stimulated or destroyed the areas of the brain along the primary motor cortex, which is this area in blue. And what they saw is that as they stimulated or destroyed these areas, there was either movements of the muscles when there was stimulation applied, or there was the cessation of movement when there was a destroyment of this area. So this was the first sort of, I guess, notion and confirmation that localization or particular areas of the brain were associated with particular roles, in this case, movement. Very shortly after, Paul Broca and Carl Wernike released their findings on aphasia and further defined the cortex as a critical brain region. Particularly, Broca identified an area in the left frontal lobe called Broca's area, which was responsible for the production of speech. And Wernike described an area of the brain on the temporal lobe here, which was responsible for the comprehension of speech. So these two actually found these by case studies. So Paul Broca found that someone who had damage to the area of the brain, which is now termed Broca's area, had these deficits in the production of speech. So they could form sentences eventually. It just took a very, very long time for them to actually be done. Whereas Wernike's area, when it was damaged, would have issues with comprehension. So instead of speaking very, very slowly and broken sentences, they would speak very fluently, but what they would say would make absolutely no sense. So this all sort of formed this idea that different parts of the brain were responsible for different things. We now know that it wasn't just purely motor control, but it was also our comprehension of language and the world around us. So it was around this time that there was a French researcher named Émile Dubois-Reymond, who hypothesized that living tissue could be driven by electric molecules rather than, I guess, animal spirits or some of those other strange and wacky hypotheses. So he believed that there were these electric molecules that were housed in muscles and nerve cells, which could allow them to propagate signals or send signals or cause them to contract. And this was later elaborated upon by one of his students called Julius Bernstein, who produced the first membrane hypothesis, which actually sort of holds up in the literature today. And that is that electrically charged molecules can cross over a membrane to cause an electrical response within these nerve cells. So this was where modern neuroscience started to be birthed. It was in these sorts of areas. There was then a man named Hermann von Helmholtz who described another nature of this nerve transmission. And he did so by using galvanometers to measure the speed of contraction along nerve fibers. So he found that it wasn't the nerves that contracted all at once, but instead the signal slowly moved across a nerve. So he found that the transmission speeds were around 25 to 40 meters per second. And in terms of today's numbers, that holds up for some of the motor neurons, but maybe not some of those faster. Oh, sorry, maybe not motor neurons. So some neurons tend to transmit at these slower speeds, but some are very much faster as well. It was around this time as well where cell staining and microscopy became very prominent in the field. And a researcher named Gage developed this staining method of cells where you could use silver nitrate to stain single cells within a network. And initially when he had sort of done this, he produced these sorts of drawings from what he had seen down the microscope. And what he had sort of hypothesized was much like balloon theory and this sort of these interconnected theories. He thought that all of these cells were part of one single network. So they were all interconnected. They were all sort of not touching, I guess, directly linked to the next cell, which was, as we now know, having heard Brian's talk, not true. And this was then pretty much blown out of the water by Ramon Cajal, who did some amazing illustrations of these silver nitrate stained cells that he did himself. And he could clearly define those areas of the cells, so the dendrites, the cell bodies, and the axons that Brian talked about in his talk. And it was through this time that Sherrington proposed that cells instead communicated through a synapse and birthed the modern neuroscience, which you would have heard a lot about today. So as Brian said, there was gaps between the neurons, and this is how they communicated. Now, this isn't an exhaustive overview of neuroscience or the history behind it, and I'm going to stop just before some of those concepts that have already been talked about. But I'm going to leave you with a quote by Charles Scott Sherrington, who posited the idea of the synapse, saying, "The brain is a mystery. It has been and still will be. how does the brain produce thoughts? That is the central question, and we still have no answer to it. I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure how great I'm going to be at answering them, just because I'm not a historian. This is just sort of a hobby interest of mine. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Nathan. That was a very, very interesting presentation put together. Sort of makes you appreciate how far we've come, and also the important milestones in history that sort of led us to where we are today. And of course, we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
Yep. So, like Nathan said, he's happy to take questions. If again, you're welcome to send us messages and emails, and we'll try to find the answers for you if we don't have the answers immediately. Yeah.
I'll take the chance to say there's some really great booths that people have put together for the website as well, sort of explaining some of the work that's being done at the Eccles Institute and some of the broad concepts of neuroscience. So if you wanted to learn about a specific system, you may find some answers up there. But yes, Felix, do you think grave robbing has contributed to neuroscience? I don't think it had to once those laws were passed, but I'm sure that there were some really shady researchers back in the day who were definitely taking things and learning about neuroanatomy. It was all very frowned upon back then to work in humans, but yeah. How do we conduct these macro scale experiments on brains today? So there's a number of ways that you can, I guess, emulate these sorts of destruction of brain tissue. Yes, railroad spikes are definitely frowned upon by the ethics committees, but often what you can do is you can use very well-established maps of the brain to chemically kill parts of the brain or chemically inhibit parts of the brain temporarily to look at the effects of those areas on particular functions. And yeah, so that's I hope that answers your question a bit more. There's a lot more than just, I guess, stabbing a particular area of the brain to look at its function throughout.
Beautiful. I think there's a few more questions. Nathan, that maybe you're better to answer. Was Brodmann role after Broca in the timeline?
Brodmann role after Broca. I can't remember too much. I'm stretching back a little bit here. I didn't go super in depth, but Brodmann did do a bit of mapping of the brain, yes. I don't know, maybe Christina wants to elaborate on that. If you can unmute her, she has a good knowledge of this sort of field.
Ask Christina.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yep, Christina, we can hear you.
Hi, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation and a great overview of how neuroscience developed into the modern science as we are now. So Brodmann was the person who was very diligently looked at every single part of the brain, the cortex, and mapped it histologically. So you mentioned that there were histological stains already by that time. And so these stainings showed that different parts of the cortex looked different. The modern cortex, neocortex, has 6 layers. And these 6 layers are distributed in different ways. So there are some areas, like you mentioned, the primary motor cortex. In that area, the motor parts, the layer 5 and 6 are really big, while the others 1 to 4 are very small. Other areas, he showed that the 1 to 4 are really big, like for example, the sensory cortices. You will hear about it from Ricardo a little bit on not the cortex itself, but vision. What one of the research focus in the Eccles Institute. So the vision cortex has a very strong 4th layer, layer 4. And then there were other layers, other areas where all 6 layers were evenly distributed. So those are now known to be associative ones. They will get information in and they will put it all together and process what's happening around us in the environment and then send that information to the rest of the body. So that's what Brodmann's job was, and that was an excellent way. And even now we have these areas, what he recognized, are numbered as Brodmann numbers. So we have a number of Brodmann areas in there, and one of the Brodmann areas is the Broca's areas, what you mentioned, and that's actually also sort of one of the numbered Broca's areas, Brodmann areas.
Thank you so much, Christina, for the extra information. Really appreciate it. In the interest of time, thanks, Reynolds. I think, Rayton, we're going to move on to the next speaker for the day.